At my son's birthday party, my mother-in-law said, "You'll never be a good mother." When I exposed what she did behind my back, she was banned from seeing him forever. The sun was pouring through the windows, spilling light over the dining room as I tried to tape up the last of the dinosaur-themed decorations for Leo's 3rd birthday. Blue and green balloons bobbed along the ceiling, and I'd spent the better part of my morning wrapping silver and gold streamers around the chairs, hoping he'd feel like the king of his own little kingdom. Simon, my husband, ducked in from the kitchen, holding a tray of snacks I'd laid out. "You really went all out, Allie. It looks great," he said, admiring the setup. I shot him a tired smile, grateful for the acknowledgement. I want it to be perfect. This is his first real party, and I thought, well, you know. I shrugged, not needing to say more. He knew exactly what I meant by that, especially when it came to his mom, Carol. Simon sighed, setting down the tray and rubbing my shoulders. "She's gonna nitpick no matter what. So just don't let her get to you, okay?" "Easier said than done," I murmured, glancing at the door. Carol hadn't arrived yet, but I could already feel her looming over every detail, waiting to pounce. Just as I was positioning the last balloon, the front door swung open, and there she was, Carol. She wore her typical perfect grandma ensemble, a beige sweater set that matched her pearls. In her hands was a stack of neatly wrapped presents, each perfectly sized, tied with bows that matched her outfit. "Allie, darling," she said, her voice as smooth as ice, eyes sweeping the room like she was surveying a crime scene. "Oh, you chose green and blue. I suppose that's festive." Her eyes landed on the dinosaur-themed cake I'd baked from scratch. "And a homemade cake. How thoughtful." Simon stepped up beside me, subtly squeezing my hand as he plastered on a smile. "Hey, Mom, yeah, Allie worked really hard on everything." Carol's mouth tightened, as if I'd forced her to chew on a lemon. "Oh, I'm sure. But, you know, they do sell lovely cakes these days." "Well, it's fine, I suppose. Leo's young, he won't notice." She brushed past us, setting the gifts down on the table with exaggerated care, as though she were afraid her careful wrapping might catch something contagious. I bit the inside of my cheek. Just keep calm, I told myself. The party was about Leo, not Carol's relentless, passive-aggressive comments. Moments later, Leo came bouncing into the room, his chubby face lighting up when he saw the decorations. "Dinosaurs!" he shrieked with delight, clapping his little hands. "Mommy made it all for you," Simon said, beaming as Leo hugged my leg. Carol was watching, arms crossed, a small frown pulling down the corners of her mouth. "Dinosaurs? Don't you think he's a little young for such an obsession? At this age, you should be fostering well-rounded interests." I opened my mouth to respond, but Simon shot me a warning look, so I forced myself to smile. "He loves dinosaurs right now, Carol. It's harmless." She gave a tight-lipped smile and took a step closer to me, lowering her voice. "You know, children tend to mirror their parents. Perhaps if he saw you pursuing more varied interests, he wouldn't be so fixated." I could feel the blood rising to my cheeks, but before I could respond, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the rest of the guests. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to let it go. Today was Leo's day, and I wasn't going to let her ruin it. As more friends and family trickled in, the room filled with laughter, chatter, and the happy shrieks of children. Leo was having the time of his life, darting from one person to the next, showing off his dinosaur figurines. I found myself able to breathe again, trying to focus on the joy in his face rather than the dark cloud of judgment I felt hanging over my shoulder. The tension reappeared when it was time to bring out the cake. I'd spent hours on it, layers of chocolate and vanilla with little dinosaur decorations on top. As I placed it on the table, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. It looked, well, perfect. Everyone started gathering around, and I could feel Carol's gaze boring into me, her lips pursed in that way she did when she was about to deliver one of her observations. "Allie," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness, "did you get this from a bakery? Because the texture looks a bit dense." I forced a smile, willing myself to stay calm. "Nope, homemade," I said, keeping my tone light. "Oh. Homemade," she repeated, like it was a curse word. "Well, I'm sure it's edible. Leo's young, he won't mind." She looked around, expecting someone to laugh, but all she got was uncomfortable silence. Just as she finished speaking, Leo, who was holding a slice of the cake, accidentally dropped a bit of icing on his shirt. Carol swooped in, her voice louder than necessary. "Oh, sweetie, here, let Nana take care of that. Poor little guy, it's no wonder with all this chaos." She shot me a pointed look, making it clear who she blamed for the chaos. "Carol, it's fine, really," I said, trying to reach for Leo, but she brushed me aside as if I were some bystander, not his mother. "Honestly, Allie," she said, in that condescending tone, "I just don't know where you find the time. These things come naturally to some people. Motherhood. It's not exactly a learned skill, you know. I clenched my fists, willing myself to keep my voice steady. I think I'm doing just fine, actually. She raised an eyebrow, that familiar, dismissive look on her face. If you say so, dear. It's not personal, I just think Leo deserves more than the bare minimum. I felt my pulse quicken, and I saw Simon's jaw tense beside me. He stepped forward, but I held up a hand, wanting to handle this myself. Carol, I know you have your opinions, but this is Leo's party. If you have something to say, maybe this isn't the place for it. Oh, don't be so sensitive, Allie, she replied, her voice dripping with mock surprise. I'm only speaking the truth. Everyone here knows that children thrive best with strong, capable mothers. There's nothing wrong with admitting that you could improve. I was speechless, the blood pounding in my ears. But then, a surge of anger pushed me to say something I never thought I would. Well, since we're sharing truths, maybe everyone should know about the little arrangement you suggested to Simon, where he'd file for sole custody of Leo. Behind my back. The room went dead silent. Carol's face drained of color, and Simon's mouth dropped open. I could feel every pair of eyes on us, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Simon turned to his mother, shock and hurt clear in his expression. Mom. What is she talking about? Carol stammered, a flush creeping up her neck. Simon, I only suggested it in passing. You know, in case things went downhill. In case things went downhill? Simon's voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Mom, what on earth made you think that was okay? Carol's face twisted, her calm facade finally cracking. I was only thinking of Leo's well-being. I've watched Allie struggle, trying to play house with you and pretend she's capable of raising a child. I thought it was in Leo's best interest to have a stable environment. I was shaking with rage, but Simon beat me to it. Mom, Allie has been nothing but amazing to Leo. She loves him with everything she has. How could you even think of suggesting something like that? You went behind her back and tried to undermine our family. Carol drew herself up, the hint of defiance returning to her face. I am his grandmother, Simon. I have a right to be concerned. A right? I repeated, my voice trembling. You have no right to interfere in our lives like this. Leo is our son, not your project to mold as you see fit. Ray, Carol's husband, had been watching the whole scene in silence, his face a mix of shock and disappointment. Finally, he spoke up, his voice low and steady. Carol, you crossed a line. This isn't the way to go about things. Carol whirled around to face him, her expression stunned.
Ray, I was only doing what I thought was right.
Ray shook his head, sadness in his eyes. No, Carol. You did what you thought was right, without a thought for what anyone else might feel. And it's cost you.
Carol's face crumpled, and for a split second, I almost felt a pang of pity.
But then she straightened, her eyes hardening again as she turned to Simon and me. You'll regret this, she said, her voice cold. Allie, you may have won this round, but don't think for a second I won't do what's necessary to protect Leo. Simon stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. Mom, if this is what protecting Leo looks like, then I think you need to stay away from him. Until you can respect our family, you're not welcome here. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Carol looked between us, her face pale with anger and disbelief. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode out of the house, the door slamming behind her. The room was thick with silence, everyone unsure of what to say. Ray cleared his throat, giving me a small nod. I'm sorry, Allie.
I had no idea she'd gone that far.
It's okay, Ray, I said quietly, exhaustion flooding through me. I just want what's best for Leo. Simon wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. I'm so sorry, Allie. I should have seen it sooner. She won't come near Leo until she apologizes. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confrontation finally lift. For the first time, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that I'd protected my family. In the end, it wasn't about Carol's approval, it was about Leo and the life we wanted to give him. Reflecting on everything now, I realized that family doesn't mean accepting every toxic behavior without question. It means standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It means protecting the people you love, no matter the cost. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes a good mother after all. A few months passed without a word from Carol. After the birthday blow-up, life settled into something that felt almost blissfully normal. Without her critical gaze constantly hovering over us, Simon and I found a new rhythm. Leo thrived, and I began to feel, for the first time since he was born, like I could relax into motherhood without feeling judged. Still, something inside me hadn't let go of that final look Carol had given us as she stormed out. You'll regret this, she'd said. It gnawed at me, a faint whisper that kept me on edge, especially since Simon and I both knew Carol wasn't the type to let things go. One Saturday morning, I was sitting in the kitchen sipping coffee, watching Leo draw at the table, when Simon walked in, his face tense. What's wrong? I asked, heart immediately picking up its pace. He dropped his phone on the counter. You're not going to believe this. My mother sent me an email last night, he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before looking up at me. She's filing for grandparent visitation rights. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. What? How? Can she even do that? Simon ran a hand through his hair. In this state, she actually can. But usually, it's only granted if there's a strong bond between the grandparent and the child or if there's proof the parent is unfit. Anger simmered beneath my shock. This is her revenge, plain and simple. She's trying to get back at me because I stood up to her. Simon nodded. But we're not going to let her get away with it. I've already contacted a lawyer. We'll fight this. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal consultations and paperwork. Our lawyer, Melissa, was sharp and confident. She explained that Carol's case was weak, she hadn't had regular contact with Leo since we cut her off, and even before that, her relationship with him was hardly close. Still, the idea of facing her in court was draining. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd find a way to turn things around, to twist the narrative to paint herself as the victim. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and I felt a knot of anxiety as we entered the courtroom. Carol was already there, seated with her own lawyer, a smug look on her face that made my blood boil. She looked up as we walked in, her eyes narrowing, lips curling into a faint, triumphant smile. It took everything in me not to glare back at her. The hearing began, and Carol's lawyer went straight into painting her as the concerned grandmother, claiming she had a deep, loving bond with Leo and that Simon and I had unreasonably cut her off out of spite. He even went as far as to imply that I'd been the one influencing Simon to keep Leo away, trying to spin the story that I was somehow manipulative and controlling. I clenched my fists, trying to keep calm as they spouted lie after lie. But then, our lawyer, Melissa, rose to our defense, and I felt a spark of hope. Your Honor, Melissa began, her voice calm but firm, Mrs. Barnes's claims are misleading, to say the least. We have evidence that she not only overstepped boundaries as a grandmother but actively sought to undermine the parents' authority and stability in the household. In fact, Mrs. Barnes attempted to coerce her son into seeking sole custody of Leo, all behind his wife's back. She paused, allowing the weight of those words to sink in. Carol's face faltered, her smug expression cracking just a bit. Melissa continued, not only that, but we also have documented texts and emails where Mrs. Barnes made several disparaging comments about Mrs. Barnes's parenting. This was an ongoing pattern of toxic behavior that Simon and Allie finally had to set boundaries for. Their decision to protect their son from emotional harm is well within their rights as parents. Then, in a move that even I hadn't anticipated, Melissa pulled out a thick folder. And Your Honor, we'd also like to introduce some concerning evidence of Mrs. Barnes's behavior, which raises questions about her ability to make rational decisions in regard to her grandson. Simon and I exchanged a quick, puzzled glance, but Melissa just gave us a small, reassuring nod. The judge flipped through the folder, his brow furrowing. Mrs. Barnes, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. It says here that you've recently made inquiries with several private investigators regarding the Barnes family? Carol's face went pale, but she quickly tried to compose herself. Well, only to ensure Leo's safety. I was concerned for his well-being. Concerned enough to try and gather dirt on them, Mrs. Barnes? Melissa interjected, holding up copies of emails Carol had sent to private investigators, asking for background checks on me, attempting to dig up any scrap of information she could use against us. Carol stammered, unable to find words. The judge shook his head, visibly unimpressed. Mrs. Barnes, it appears you've crossed a line here. The court takes privacy and parental authority seriously. Your behavior suggests a disturbing lack of boundaries. At that, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. After a few more testimonies, including a character witness statement from our close friend, the judge finally delivered his decision. It is clear to this court that the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Barnes, have every right to determine what is best for their son. The evidence shows a pattern of intrusive and manipulative behavior on Mrs. Barnes's part. This court denies her request for visitation and orders that Mrs. Barnes have no further contact with the child unless agreed upon by both parents. Carol's face went from pale to furious. She stood up, fists clenched, and I half expected her to shout. Instead, she turned to Simon, her voice a hiss. I am your mother, Simon. How dare you let this woman tear our family apart? Simon took a step toward her, his expression cold. No, Mom. You tore this family apart the moment you tried to undermine my wife and threaten our home. I think it's time you left. Without another word, Carol stormed out of the courtroom. The door echoed as it closed behind her, and the silence that followed felt like an enormous weight lifting. I turned to Simon, barely able to believe it was over. She's really gone, I whispered. He pulled me into a hug, his voice soft. Yeah, and she's not coming back. We're free. In the months that followed, I felt like we finally had our lives back. No more unexpected visits, no more critical comments or underhanded manipulation. Simon and I were closer than ever, and Leo flourished, happy and secure in a home free of tension. One afternoon, as I was walking through the park with Leo, He tugged on my hand and pointed at a family playing nearby, a grandmother, mother, and child laughing together on a picnic blanket. I felt a pang, a reminder of the relationship Carol could have had with Leo if she just respected us. But then Leo looked up at me, his eyes bright and trusting. "I love you, Mommy," he said, wrapping his tiny arms around my leg. I crouched down, pulling him into a hug, my heart swelling. "I love you too, buddy. More than you'll ever know." As we walked away from the park that day, I felt a strange sense of peace. Carol might never be part of our lives again, but maybe that was okay. Our family was safe, strong, and full of love, and in the end, that was all that mattered.